The night Isabella Carter disappeared from her billionaire parents' mansion, the entire city stopped breathing. Police cars flooded the streets. News helicopters circled above the massive estate. Reporters shouted questions through the tall black gates, while flashing cameras lit up the darkness like lightning. People thought a child had been kidnapped. Some believed enemies of her father had taken her for ransom. Others whispered darker things, but the truth was far more heartbreaking. Nobody had taken Isabella. She had walked away on her own, and all because she wanted something money could never buy. Love. Inside the Grand Carter mansion, every light glowed against the midnight sky. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers worth more than most homes. Expensive paintings covered the walls. Rare flowers decorated tables polished so perfectly they looked untouched. To the world, the Carter family lived a dream life. Richard Carter was one of the richest men in America. He owned hotels, banks, technology companies across the world. Magazine covers called him a genius. Business channels praised his discipline and power. Beside him stood his wife, Victoria Carter, a beautiful former actress turned fashion icon. Every photograph of them looked perfect. Every interview sounded perfect. But their home was not, because hidden behind all the wealth and glamour was a little girl who cried herself to sleep, almost every night. Old Isabella had everything except the one thing she wanted most, her parents. Every morning she woke up in a bedroom bigger than most apartments. Rows of dolls sat untouched on shelves. Dresses worth thousands filled her closet. Her bathroom sparkled with gold fixtures imported from Europe. Outside her balcony stood a private garden with a fountain shaped like angels. Yet the room always felt cold, lonely, empty. Because every morning she opened her eyes, hoping today would be different. And every morning disappointment waited for her again. Your father already left for the airport, the housekeeper Maria would say gently while helping Isabella brush her hair. Or sometimes, your mother had an early photo shoot, sweetheart. At first Isabella used to ask questions. When will they come home? Will they eat dinner with me tonight? Can mommy read my story later? But over time, even a child can grow tired of hoping. So eventually she stopped asking. The Carter mansion was filled with workers. Chefs cooked meals nobody shared together. Security guards stood outside every gate. Drivers waited beside expensive cars. Cleaners quietly moved through hallways like ghosts. Everyone did their job perfectly. Everyone except the two people Isabella truly needed. Sometimes Richard returned home, after midnight smelling like expensive cologne and exhaustion. He would kiss Isabella's forehead while she pretended to sleep, whispering promises he never kept. We'll spend the weekend together. But weekends became meetings. Meetings became months. And months slowly became years. Victoria was not much different. Her days disappeared into fashion events, interviews, parties, and luxury vacations that somehow never included her daughter. Even when she was physically home, her attention belonged to glowing phone screens and endless business calls. One evening Isabella sat beside the staircase wearing a small blue dress she had picked herself. She had waited there for almost 2 hours, holding a drawing she made at school. It showed 3 people holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. A family. When Victoria finally walked through the front doors, surrounded by assistants, Isabella's face lit up instantly. "Mommy, look what I made." Victoria barely glanced at the paper before removing her sunglasses. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Not now though, okay? Mommy has a headache." Then she disappeared upstairs. Isabella remained frozen near the staircase long after the sound of heels faded away. Drawing slowly slipped from her fingers onto the floor. Maria later found it crumpled beside the wall. That night, Isabella cried silently beneath her blankets, while hugging her stuffed rabbit close to her chest. Her tiny voice trembled in the darkness. "Why am I never enough?" At school things hurt even more. Every Friday parents visited for lunch. Children laughed while mothers unpacked homemade meals. Fathers helped with homework. Families crowded picnic tables under the warm sun while cameras captured smiling memories. Isabella always sat alone. Sometimes Maria came instead, trying desperately to fill the empty space beside her. She brought Isabella's favorite snacks and spoke kindly. Isabella still watched the school gates, hoping her parents might suddenly appear. They never did. One afternoon, her teacher announced a family art competition. Students would create projects with their parents. Excitement exploded across the classroom. "My dad is helping me build a volcano," one boy shouted proudly. "My mom already bought glitter," another girl laughed. The teacher smiled warmly before looking toward Isabella. "What about you?" Isabella forced a smile so small it almost broke. "I'm not sure if my parents are busy yet." But deep inside, she already knew. That evening she waited in Richard's office for over an hour while he finished a business call. Finally, he muted the phone and looked toward her. "What is it, princess?" "There's a family project at school." "That sounds nice. I need help." Richard sighed while rubbing his forehead. "Can't Maria help you?" "It has to be parents." "Sweetheart, Daddy's very busy right now." The disappointment on Isabella's face appeared so quickly Richard almost looked away from it. "Maybe next time," he added absent-mindedly before returning to his laptop. Next time. Those words followed Isabella everywhere. Next time. Next weekend. Later. Soon. But love delayed long enough begins to feel like love denied. Days passed quietly inside the mansion. At dinner, Isabella often sat alone at a table designed for 20 people. Crystal glasses sparkled under chandeliers while servants brought expensive meals nobody truly tasted. The silence felt enormous. One rainy night, thunder rattled the windows. While Isabella wandered through the endless halls, holding her rabbit, she stopped outside her parents' bedroom. Inside, Victoria and Richard were arguing. "You missed her recital again," Victoria snapped. "I was closing a $1 billion deal." She cried herself to sleep. "And where were you?" "Shopping in Paris. At least I care enough to notice." Richard laughed bitterly. "Oh, please. You care about magazine covers more than your own child." Isabella backed away slowly before either parent noticed her standing there. Her chest hurt, not because they were fighting, 'cause even while blaming each other, neither one realized the real problem. Her, or at least that was what she believed. Children often blame themselves for the absence of love. That night she sat beside her bedroom window, watching rain slide down the glass like tears. Far below, the city lights flickered endlessly. Somewhere out there families were laughing together. Somewhere fathers tucked daughters into bed. Somewhere mothers kissed scraped knees and listened to bedtime stories. Isabella pressed her forehead against the cold window. "I wish someone wanted me," she whispered softly. Weeks later, the school announced its annual talent showcase. Parents filled the auditorium carrying flowers and balloons. Excitement buzzed through every row. Backstage, Isabella adjusted the white piano dress Maria had carefully ironed for her. "You'll do amazing," Maria said warmly. "Do you think they'll come?" Maria hesitated only a second too long. "I hope so, sweetheart." The answer already lived inside that silence. When Isabella stepped onto the stage, bright lights blinded her for a moment. She searched the crowd instinctively. Hundreds of faces, but not theirs. 2 empty seats in the front row hurt more than any words could. Still, she played beautifully. Tiny fingers danced across piano keys, while sadness poured quietly into every note. By the end, many parents wiped tears from their eyes. The audience erupted into applause. But Isabella only stared at the empty chairs. After the performance, children ran into waiting hugs. Flowers filled the room. Laughter echoed everywhere. Meanwhile, Isabella stood alone beside the stage, holding her music sheets against her chest. Maria arrived 20 minutes later, breathless from traffic. "You were wonderful." Isabella nodded politely. In the car ride home, she looked out the window silently while city lights blurred past. "Your parents are proud of you," Maria said carefully, but they weren't there. No answer came after that. The mansion greeted them with its usual cold perfection. Staff members moved quietly through polished hallways. Somewhere upstairs, Victoria prepared for another gala while Richard argued through Bluetooth headphones about stock prices. Neither noticed Isabella walk through the front doors, still carrying her piano music. That night, she opened a small wooden box hidden beneath her bed. Inside were tiny memories she secretly treasured. Card Richard signed 3 years earlier. A photograph of Victoria kissing her cheek when she was little. A seashell from the only family vacation they ever took together. And beneath those things sat a folded note Isabella had written weeks ago, but never showed anyone. It simply said, "If I disappeared, would they finally notice me?" The next morning, the mansion buzzed with its usual rhythm of expensive chaos. Phones rang endlessly. Assistants hurried through hallways, carrying schedules and coffee cups. Drivers lined luxury cars outside the gates, while security guards checked cameras and entrances with mechanical precision. But nobody noticed the little girl sitting quietly at the breakfast table, staring at untouched pancakes. Richard had already left for Chicago before sunrise. Victoria was upstairs preparing for a television interview. Maria poured orange juice into Isabella's glass and forced a gentle smile. "You should eat something, sweetheart. I'm not hungry." Maria sat beside her carefully. "Do you want me to braid your hair today?" Isabella shrugged without lifting her eyes. Children who feel unloved often stop asking for attention because disappointment becomes too heavy to carry. Slowly they retreat into silence. And silence had become Isabella's safest place. At school, her teacher handed back essays students wrote about their families. Most children described vacations, movie nights, ping trips, and bedtime stories. Isabella's paper had only 6 words written neatly across the page. "My parents are very important people, nothing more." Her teacher, Mrs. Howard, crouched beside her desk gently. "Sweetheart, is everything okay at home?" Isabella immediately smiled the same polite smile she used whenever adults got too close to the truth. "Yes, ma'am." But Mrs. Howard noticed the sadness hidden behind it. Teachers often see the wounds children try hardest to hide. That afternoon, Isabella overheard 2 girls whispering near the lockers. "She's rich, but always alone. I heard her parents don't even come to school events." "Maybe they don't like kids." The girls laughed softly before noticing Isabella standing nearby. Awkward silence followed. Isabella pretended she heard nothing, but every word stayed inside her chest long after. When Maria picked her up from school, Isabella rested her head quietly against the car window. Outside, parents held children's hands while crossing busy streets. Fathers carried sleepy toddlers on their shoulders. Mothers laughed beside strollers. Simple things, ordinary things. Yet to Isabella they looked more precious than all the diamonds hidden inside the Carter mansion. That evening, Victoria hosted a charity gala at the house. Wealthy guests filled every room wearing designer clothes and expensive smiles. Crystal glasses clinked beneath golden lights while cameras flashed endlessly. Maria helped Isabella into a beautiful silver dress. "You look like a princess. Can I stay upstairs?" "Your mother wants you to greet the guests first." Isabella nodded quietly. Downstairs, strangers constantly touched her shoulders and cheeks. "She's gorgeous. She looks exactly like Victoria. What a lucky little girl." Lucky. The word made Isabella feel strangely hollow. One wealthy woman bent down, smiling brightly. "Tell me, sweetheart, what's the best thing about having billionaire parents?" Isabella hesitated, then answered honestly, "I don't know." The woman laughed, assuming it was a joke. But Richard, standing nearby with business partners, briefly glanced toward his daughter. For one tiny second, guilt crossed his face. Then another phone call pulled him away again. Hours later, Isabella slipped upstairs unnoticed while music and laughter echoed below. She sat beside her bedroom window, hugging her rabbit tightly. Far beneath her balcony, she watched expensive cars arrive one after another, carrying people her parents somehow always had time for. Tears filled her eyes slowly. "Maybe if I wasn't here, nothing would change," she whispered. At that exact moment downstairs, Victoria raised a champagne glass while giving a speech about family values and building strong communities. The irony would have been painful if it were not already tragic. Days later, Isabella found herself sitting outside the principal's office. After getting into a fight at school, a boy named Trevor had laughed during recess. "At least my parents love me." Before Isabella even realized what happened, she shoved him hard enough to knock him backward into the dirt. Now she sat trembling with guilt while Mrs. Howard waited beside her. When Richard finally arrived nearly 2 hours later, frustration already covered his face. "I had to leave an investor meeting for this." Isabella looked down instantly. The principal explained what happened calmly. Richard listened impatiently before turning toward Isabella. "You know better than this." Trevor's mother crossed her arms smugly nearby. "She attacked my son for no reason." Richard rubbed his temples. "I apologize. It won't happen again." No one asked Isabella why she snapped. No one noticed the tears burning behind her eyes. In the car ride home, silence stretched painfully between them. Finally, Isabella whispered, "He said you don't love me." Richard exhaled sharply. "Kids say stupid things. But is it true?" Richard looked genuinely stunned for a moment. "Of course not." "Then, why are you never there?" The question hung inside the car like smoke. Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "I work hard for this family. I don't care about the money." "That's easy to say when you've never gone without anything." "I'd give it all back." Her voice cracked unexpectedly. "All of it." Richard finally looked toward her properly, and what he saw frightened him. Not anger, not rebellion, loneliness. Pure heartbreaking loneliness sitting inside the eyes of a 10-year-old girl. But before he could respond, his phone rang again. Business. Always business. He answered automatically, and the moment disappeared. That night, Isabella ate dinner alone again. The dining room looked enormous around her. One tiny child sitting beneath giant chandeliers, while servants quietly refilled untouched plates. Halfway through the meal, she suddenly asked the chef, "Do you think parents can forget they have children?" The older man froze awkwardly. "No, sweetheart." "Then why does it feel like mine did?" He had no answer. Later, Maria tucked Isabel into bed while thunder rolled outside. "You know your parents love you." Isabella stared toward the ceiling. "People keep saying that." "Because it's true." "Then why does it hurt so much?" Maria's eyes filled instantly. She brushed Isabella's hair softly before kissing her forehead. Some pains adults cannot explain away with comforting words, especially when the child is right. Weeks passed. The loneliness inside Isabella slowly deepened into something heavier, something dangerous. Children deprived of emotional connection often begin believing they are invisible, and invisible people eventually disappear. One afternoon, while walking home from school with Maria, Isabella noticed a little girl around her age sitting on a park bench laughing with her parents over melting ice cream cones. The father suddenly lifted his daughter high into the air while she squealed happily. The mother captured photos while laughing beside them. The scene lasted only seconds. Isabella stared at it as though watching another universe. "Can we get ice cream too?" she asked quietly. "Of course." "That's not what I mean." Maria looked at her carefully. "I want someone to laugh with me like that." The sadness inside those words nearly shattered her. That evening, Isabella found an old family video hidden inside a drawer. She played it alone in her room. The footage showed Richard holding baby Isabella while Victoria laughed nearby on a beach years earlier, looked genuinely happy, relaxed, loving, different. Isabella replayed the clip over and over. At one point, tiny baby Isabella grabbed Richard's nose while both parents laughed loudly. Watching it felt almost unreal. Truly loved her once. Or had she imagined it? A few nights later, Victoria returned home, early from an event unexpectedly. As she walked past Isabella's room, she heard quiet crying inside. She paused outside the door. Part of her wanted to enter immediately. Another part feared what she might hear. Finally, she stepped inside softly. Isabella quickly wiped her tears. "Mommy." Victoria sat carefully beside her bed. "What's wrong?" For a long moment, Isabella said nothing. Then finally whispered, "Did I do something bad?" Victoria frowned. "What? Why don't you and Daddy want to be with me?" The words sliced through Victoria's chest instantly. "Oh, sweetheart, no." "Then why am I always alone?" Victoria opened her mouth, closed it again. Because there was no easy answer. Success had consumed them slowly over the years. One meeting became another. One event became 10. Convinced themselves they were building a perfect future for their daughter, while missing her entire childhood in the process. And now the damage sat crying quietly beside her. Victoria reached toward Isabella gently, but Isabella flinched backward before she could stop herself. The movement lasted barely a second. Yet it devastated Victoria completely, because children only flinch from people who feel unfamiliar. That night, Victoria sat awake long after midnight, staring at old photographs scattered across the bed. Family vacations, birthday parties, school events. As years passed, Isabella appeared smiling alone more and more often. Richard eventually entered the room, exhausted from another late flight. "You're still awake." Victoria held up a photograph silently. It showed 6-year-old Isabella at a ballet recital standing alone beside empty seats. "Do you remember this?" Richard loosened his tie tiredly. "Not really. She asked me tonight if she did something wrong." Richard froze. Victoria's voice trembled. "Our daughter thinks we don't love her." For the first time in years, silence filled the room without phones or meetings interrupting it. Heavy silence. Honest silence. The kind successful people spend entire lives trying to avoid. Richard barely slept that night. Long after Victoria finally closed her eyes, he remained sitting beside the dark bedroom window, staring out at the glowing city beneath them. Thousands of lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Businesses he owned. Buildings carrying his name. Wealth powerful enough to influence governments. Yet none of it could silence the sentence repeating inside his head. "Our daughter thinks we don't love her." By sunrise, he was already dressed for another flight to London. His assistant waited downstairs with schedules packed from morning until midnight. Still, Richard stood motionless outside Isabella's bedroom door. For several seconds, he considered knocking. Then his phone buzzed. Another urgent call. Another problem requiring his attention. Habit won the battle again, and within minutes his car disappeared through the mansion gates, while Isabella still slept upstairs. At breakfast, Victoria tried harder than usual. She sat beside Isabella instead of scrolling through emails. She even attempted conversation. "How about we go shopping this weekend together?" Isabella looked surprised. "Really?" "Yes." "Just us girls." Hope flickered briefly across Isabella's face before caution replaced it. "You won't cancel." Victoria hesitated too long, and hope disappeared just as quickly. "Probably," Isabella whispered quietly before returning to her cereal. The honesty of that answer hurt more than anger ever could. Later that afternoon, Victoria indeed cancelled. A luxury fashion company offered her a last-minute interview opportunity in Milan. Just 3 days. she promised over the phone, while assistants rushed around her packing luggage. Isabella stood silently nearby, clutching the shopping bag she had prepared earlier. Inside was a small notebook where she planned to paste photographs from their weekend together. Now it remained empty. After Victoria left, Isabella slowly carried the notebook upstairs and placed it beneath her bed beside the other forgotten hopes she no longer discussed. Sometimes disappointment repeated enough becomes expectation. At school, preparations for Family Celebration Day filled every classroom. Parents would attend games, performances, and activities with their children all afternoon. Students buzzed with excitement. Isabella dreaded it. Mrs. Howard noticed immediately. "Your parents coming this year?" Isabella forced another small smile. "They're busy." Mrs. Howard crouched beside her desk gently. "You know, sweetheart, being busy doesn't always mean people don't care. But it feels like it." The teacher had no answer strong enough for that truth. Meanwhile, Richard landed in London, surrounded by flashing cameras and business partners, praising his latest $1 billion deal. During interviews, reporters asked about success, leadership, and sacrifice. One reporter smiled brightly. "What keeps you motivated after achieving so much?" Richard answered automatically. "Family." The word tasted strange leaving his mouth. That evening, inside a luxury hotel suite, Richard received a photo from Maria. It showed Isabella eating dinner alone at the massive dining table. The image disturbed him more than he expected. She looked tiny, almost swallowed by the emptiness around her. Maria attached a simple message beneath the picture. "She barely speaks anymore." Richard stared at the screen for a very long time, then placed the phone face down without replying, because guilt is easier to silence than confront. Back home, Isabella wandered through the mansion, carrying her stuffed rabbit. Rain tapped softly against giant windows, while staff moved quietly through distant halls. The house felt less like a home and more like a museum nobody truly lived inside. She stopped outside the ballroom, where workers prepared decorations for another upcoming charity event. Strings of lights sparkled beautifully from the ceiling. Flowers covered every table. Everything looked perfect. Isabella suddenly felt angry. Deeply angry. Not because the mansion was beautiful, because somehow strangers always received the best parts of her parents, while she survived on leftovers. That night, she wrote something new inside her secret notebook. "If money makes people forget love, then I hate money." The following morning, Family Celebration Day finally arrived. Children ran excitedly through the school entrance, beside laughing parents carrying snacks and balloons. Teachers welcomed families warmly, while music played across the playground. Maria drove Isabella there quietly. "Maybe they'll surprise you." But both already knew better. As activities began, Isabella sat alone beneath a tree, pretending to read. Nearby fathers raced their children through obstacle courses, while mothers painted faces and took endless photographs. Laughter echoed everywhere. The loneliness became unbearable. At one point, a little girl approached Isabella shyly. "Where's your family?" Isabella looked across the crowded field, then answered softly, "I don't think they know I'm here." The words nearly broke Maria's heart. Hours later, while children hugged parents goodbye, Isabella remained seated alone under the same tree. Mrs. Howard eventually sat beside her. "You okay?" Isabella nodded automatically, suddenly asked something unexpected. "Do you think some people shouldn't have kids?" The teacher blinked in surprise. "Why would you ask that?" "Because maybe some parents love work more." Mrs. Howard inhaled slowly. "Your parents probably think they're doing the right thing. But they're not." The certainty inside Isabella's voice sounded far older than 10 years old. That evening, Richard finally returned from London exhausted and distracted. He found Isabella asleep on the living room couch, still wearing her school clothes. A small participation ribbon rested beside her, lit up carefully. Family Celebration Day. Something twisted painfully inside his chest. Maria appeared quietly nearby. She waited all afternoon, hoping one of you would come. Richard looked toward his sleeping daughter. Dark circles shadowed beneath her eyes despite her age. Even in sleep, she looked sad. When did she stop smiling so much? He whispered. Maria answered honestly. A long time ago. Those words haunted him all night. The next morning Richard attempted something unfamiliar. He cancelled his morning meetings. At breakfast, Isabella nearly dropped her spoon, seeing him still home. You're not leaving. Not today. Why? The question carried genuine confusion. Richard forced a small smile. I thought maybe we could spend time together. For the first time in months, Isabella's eyes brightened. Really? Really? Spent the morning walking through the city park accompanied by distant security guards, pretending not to watch. Richard bought her ice cream himself instead of sending assistants, fed ducks beside the lake, while autumn leaves drifted through cool air. At first, conversation felt awkward, like strangers trying to reconnect after years apart. But slowly Isabella relaxed. She laughed when Richard accidentally dropped bird food onto his expensive shoes. She smiled while teaching him how to skip stones across the water. For several beautiful hours, they simply existed together, father and daughter. Nothing more, nothing less. And Richard realized something terrifying. He had almost forgotten how wonderful his child truly was. On the drive home, Isabella leaned against the seat, smiling softly. This was my favorite day ever. The sentence devastated him. Because all they had done was spend ordinary time together. No luxury, no extravagant gifts, just presence. Yet to Isabella it meant everything. Back at the mansion, Richard carried a strange heaviness inside him. Guilt mixed with awakening. For years he believed providing financially was enough. He convinced himself sacrifice now would guarantee Isabella a perfect future later. Children do not live in later. They live in now. And now was slipping away. That evening Victoria returned from Milan exhausted, but triumphant over her successful interview. Did you miss me? She asked lightly while entering the living room. Isabella hesitated, then quietly answered, a little. The hesitation stung sharply. Later that night, Richard confronted Victoria privately. We need to change. Victoria sighed tiredly. Not this again. She's hurting. She's dramatic sometimes. Richard stared at her in disbelief. She asked if some people shouldn't have children. Victoria's expression shifted instantly. She said that. Yes. Silence filled the room. Finally, Victoria sat slowly onto the couch. What happened to us? Neither answered immediately, because deep down both already knew. Success had not destroyed their family overnight. It happened gradually, tiny neglects accumulating over years until emotional distance became normal. One missed recital, one cancelled vacation, one ignored conversation at a time, until eventually their daughter stopped expecting love altogether. The realization terrified them. Fear alone does not create change. Action does. And unfortunately, life rarely waits patiently while people figure themselves out. 2 nights later, Isabella overheard another argument downstairs. This time it was worse. You can't just cancel everything, Toria snapped. And you can. At least my career depends on visibility. Our daughter depends on us. And suddenly you care now. The shouting echoed through the mansion walls. Isabella quietly backed away from the staircase, clutching her rabbit tightly against her chest. Tears burned her eyes again. Even when trying to fix things, her parents still seemed more connected to conflict than love. She returned to her room and opened the notebook beneath her bed. For several long moments, she stared at the page silently. Then slowly she wrote, "Maybe if I leave, they'll finally notice." For the next few days, Isabella carried the thought quietly inside her chest, like a secret too painful to speak aloud. Maybe if I leave, they'll finally notice. The idea frightened her at first, but loneliness frightened her more. Children can survive without luxury, can survive small homes, old clothes, and ordinary lives. Surviving without emotional connection slowly empties them from the inside. And Isabella was beginning to feel empty. One cold Thursday morning, she sat beside the classroom window, watching rain slide down the glass, while Mrs. Howard taught fractions at the board. Around her, students whispered and laughed softly, but Isabella barely heard them. Her mind stayed trapped inside the same painful question. Would her parents even realize she was gone right away? That thought hurt most of all. At lunch, she sat alone beneath the covered walkway near the playground. Nearby parents delivered forgotten lunches and hugged children before rushing back to work. A little boy dropped his sandwich accidentally and burst into tears. His mother immediately knelt beside him, wiping his face while comforting him gently. "It's okay, baby. We'll get another one." Such a small moment. Isabella watched it with heartbreaking intensity, because no one had comforted her like that in years. That afternoon, she received another perfect score on a science test. Once she would have rushed home excited to show her parents. Now she quietly folded the paper into her backpack without emotion. Achievements stop feeling meaningful when nobody celebrates them with you. At home, Maria noticed the change growing deeper each day. Isabella no longer asked hopeful questions, no longer waited by windows, no longer smiled much at all. Instead, she wandered silently through the mansion like a tiny ghost haunting rooms too large for happiness. One evening, Maria found her sitting inside the massive walk-in closet belonging to Victoria. Designer dresses surrounded her on every side. "What are you doing in here, sweetheart?" Isabella looked up quietly. "It smells like mommy." Maria's heart nearly shattered. Child missed her mother so much she sat inside closets just to feel close to her. That night, Richard attempted another family dinner. He instructed the chef to prepare Isabella's favorite foods and even turned his phone off completely. A rare act. When Isabella entered the dining room and saw both parents waiting, confusion crossed her face instantly. "You're both home," Victoria smiled carefully. "We wanted dinner together." The evening started awkwardly but peacefully enough. Richard asked about school. Victoria complimented Isabella's new hairstyle. For a brief moment, things almost resembled a normal family. Then Richard's second phone began vibrating from his office upstairs. He ignored it. Moments later, Victoria's assistant called twice in a row. She ignored that too. But tension slowly crept into the room. By the third unanswered call, both parents looked visibly distracted. Isabella noticed immediately. Children always notice. Finally, Victoria sighed heavily. "I just need 5 minutes." Richard stood too. "I should handle this quickly." Within seconds, both disappeared from the table. Isabella remained seated alone beneath the chandelier, staring at untouched pasta. 5 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. Eventually, Maria entered quietly and found Isabella asleep at the table with her head resting beside her plate. Richard and Victoria were still working separately in different rooms. The image haunted Maria deeply. The next morning, Isabella made a decision. After school, she walked into a small convenience store near campus, while Maria waited outside speaking on the phone. Using money from her allowance, Isabella secretly bought 3 things: a city bus map, a flashlight, and a notebook small enough to fit inside her backpack. That night, she studied the bus routes carefully beneath her blankets, while the mansion slept around her. Every highlighted line represented possibility. Escape. Maybe somewhere beyond the giant gates, people actually had time to love each other. The following week, Isabella's school announced winter break. Most students exploded with excitement discussing family vacations and holiday traditions. Trevor bragged about skiing in Switzerland. Another girl talked excitedly about visiting grandparents in Texas. Mrs. Howard smiled warmly at Isabella. "What about your holiday plans?" Before Isabella could answer, Trevor laughed loudly. Her parents probably just buy her another pony instead. Several children giggled. Isabella lowered her eyes silently, 'cause even cruel jokes often contain painful truth. After school, she walked slower than usual toward the pickup area. Families gathered everywhere. Children climbed into cars between smiling parents discussing dinner plans. Meanwhile, a driver waited beside the Carter vehicle, checking his watch impatiently. Not Richard. Not Victoria. Just another employee. That night, Isabella overheard Richard telling someone on the phone he would spend Christmas in Tokyo closing an international deal. Victoria planned to attend fashion events in Paris. Separate trips. Separate priorities. Separate lives. Not once during the conversation did either mention what Isabella would do for the holidays. She sat outside the study door hugging her rabbit, while tears rolled silently down her cheeks. Finally, she returned upstairs and opened the small notebook she bought earlier. On the first page, she carefully wrote, "Things I need if I leave." Then she made a list: clothes, snacks, money, Mr. Bunny, family picture. The handwriting looked painfully neat for such a heartbreaking plan. Over the next several days, Isabella quietly prepared. She hid granola bars beneath her bed, collected small amounts of cash from birthday cards, packed warm socks into her backpack one piece at a time so nobody noticed. Entire mansion remained too busy to see what was happening directly in front of them. One evening, Maria entered unexpectedly while Isabella packed. The child slammed the drawer shut immediately. Maria frowned slightly. "What are you hiding?" "Nothing. But children who feel abandoned become excellent liars because honesty often feels unsafe." Maria kissed her forehead gently before leaving. Yet unease lingered inside her afterward. Meanwhile, Richard and Victoria continued trying unsuccessfully to balance guilt with ambition. Both loved Isabella in their own broken way. They had spent so many years prioritizing success that slowing down now felt almost impossible. One night, Victoria entered Isabella's room carrying tickets. "I have a surprise." Isabella looked up cautiously. "What is it?" "A mother-daughter spa weekend." For a moment, excitement flickered again. Then Victoria added softly, "After my Paris event next week." The light disappeared from Isabella's eyes immediately. Everything always came after something else. Always delayed. Always postponed. Later that same night, Isabella wandered downstairs unable to sleep. The mansion felt enormous in darkness. Cold moonlight spilled across marble floors while distant clocks ticked softly through empty halls. She stopped beside a giant family portrait hanging near the staircase. The painting showed Richard smiling proudly beside Victoria, while young Isabella sat between them laughing brightly. Perfect. Beautiful. Because the family inside that portrait no longer existed. Maybe it never truly did. Isabella touched the painted image of her parents gently. "Why don't you love me anymore?" she whispered. No answer came, only silence. The next morning at breakfast, Richard noticed Isabella looked exhausted. "You sleeping okay?" She nodded automatically. Dark circles beneath her eyes told another story. Richard suddenly remembered something important. Her birthday. Only 4 days away. Guilt tightened instantly inside him because he almost forgot again. "What do you want this year, Princess?" Isabella stared at him quietly, then asked the question he least expected. "Can you stay home?" Richard froze. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. "My birthday falls on Saturday." He already knew that, and unfortunately Saturday also contained an investor conference planned months earlier. One worth millions. Toria immediately jumped in. "We'll celebrate Sunday too." But Isabella shook her head softly. "It's okay." Those 2 words sounded devastatingly adult, coming from a 10-year-old child. That evening, Isabella sat alone by her bedroom window, watching snow begin falling softly across the city. Beautiful white flakes covered the giant gardens below. Everything looked peaceful. Yet inside her chest a storm continued growing stronger. She opened her notebook again. This time she wrote only one sentence. Nobody would miss me until I was gone. And for the first time since imagining leaving, Isabella stopped feeling afraid, 'cause hopelessness often removes fear completely. The morning of Isabella's birthday arrived cold and gray. Snow covered the city in thick white layers, while icy wind rattled against the mansion windows. Staff moved quietly through hallways preparing decorations ordered weeks earlier by assistants rather than parents. Giant floral arrangements filled the dining room. Expensive gifts waited neatly wrapped beneath silver ribbons. Everything looked perfect, everything felt empty. Isabella woke before sunrise and sat silently, in bed staring at the falling snow outside her window. For a moment she allowed herself one final hope. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe her father cancelled his conference. Maybe her mother skipped Paris. Maybe love would finally matter more than business. Downstairs she found Maria placing candles onto a giant birthday cake. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Maria whispered warmly, pulling her into a hug. "Thank you." Maria studied her carefully. "You okay?" Isabella nodded automatically again. The lie had become second nature. At 8:30 Richard hurried downstairs wearing a tailored black coat while speaking into an earpiece. Assistants followed behind carrying folders and laptops. When he saw Isabella standing there in her pajamas, flashed across his face instantly. "Princess, you're leaving." It wasn't a question. Richard knelt beside her quickly. "I'll be back tonight, I promise." "You promised last year too." The words hit harder than shouting. Victoria entered moments later pulling gloves onto her hands while another assistant discussed airport timing beside her. "Sweetheart, Mommy has to catch a flight, but we planned something huge for tomorrow." Isabella stared silently at both parents, then quietly asked, "Why am I never more important?" Neither answered immediately, because there was no good answer. Richard touched her shoulder gently. "Everything we do is for you." "No," Isabella whispered softly. "Everything you do is for work." The truth froze the room. For one painful second Richard looked ready to stay, but his phone rang again, and habit won. Within minutes both parents disappeared through the mansion doors, leaving behind expensive presents and a child. Trying not to cry on her birthday, Maria held Isabella tightly afterward while tears finally escaped. "I hate birthdays." That sentence nearly broke the older woman completely. The rest of the day passed painfully slow. Staff attempted celebrations. The chef prepared favorite foods. Employees wished her happy birthday politely. But none of it mattered, because the only people Isabella wanted simply were not there. That evening snowstorms worsened across the city. Flights delayed, roads iced over. News channels warned residents to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. At 7 o'clock Richard called briefly from Chicago. "I'm trying to get back tonight." "You don't have to." "Isabella, it's okay." Again those words. Again that heartbreaking emptiness inside her voice. Victoria called next from Paris. "Mummy bought you something amazing." "I don't want gifts." "Then what do you want?" Isabella almost answered honestly. "You." Instead she whispered, "Nothing." That night, after everyone went to sleep, Isabella sat on her bedroom floor beside her packed backpack. The storm outside howled louder now. Wind slammed snow against windows violently. Perfect weather for disappearing. She looked around the giant bedroom one final time. Luxury toys, designer clothes. Everything money could provide. Yet somehow none of it ever made her feel loved. Slowly she picked up the family photo hidden beneath her bed and slipped it carefully into her backpack. Then she wrote a final note. "I tried to be good enough." The handwriting shook from tears. At exactly 11:43 p.m., Isabella quietly opened her bedroom door and stepped into the dark hallway. The mansion slept peacefully around her. Nobody heard the small footsteps moving downstairs. Nobody saw the tiny figure wearing a winter coat, too large for her, carrying heartbreak heavier than any child should. She paused briefly at the front entrance. Part of her still hoped someone would stop her. Someone would notice. Someone would finally choose her. But silence filled the house. So Isabella opened the door and disappeared into the storm. Outside, freezing wind immediately wrapped around her. Snow reached nearly to her knees in some places as she struggled through the long driveway toward the security gates. Guards remained inside their heated booth, focused on football highlights playing on television screens. Barely glanced up when a small bundled figure slipped through the side service entrance. Within minutes, Isabella vanished into the snowy streets beyond the mansion. Back inside, Maria woke suddenly around midnight, feeling strangely uneasy. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. She hurried upstairs toward Isabella's room and knocked softly. No answer. Opening the door, she found the bed empty. Cold panic exploded instantly inside her chest. Isabella? Bathroom empty. Closet empty. Maria noticed the open window curtains fluttering slightly beside disturbed snow prints near the balcony. Her blood turned to ice. She ran downstairs screaming for security. Within minutes, the entire mansion erupted into chaos. Phones rang. Guards searched grounds desperately. Drivers scanned nearby streets through heavy snowfall. But Isabella was already gone. Richard received the call while preparing for a late investor dinner. At first, he didn't understand the words. She's what? She's missing. Maria cried through broken sobs. We can't find her anywhere. Everything inside Richard stopped. His entire world narrowed into pure terror. He immediately abandoned the conference and rushed toward the airport. While calling every police contact he knew, Victoria collapsed inside her Paris hotel suite after hearing the news. No. For the first time in years, neither cared about meetings, interviews, money, or reputation. Only Isabella, only their daughter. Back in New York, police launched a citywide search despite worsening weather conditions. Officers checked bus stations, parks, shelters, and train terminals, while helicopters struggled against the storm overhead. Richard arrived home shortly before dawn looking unrecognizable, tie gone, hair disabled, eyes filled with fear. He stormed through Isabella's room, desperately searching for clues, until he found the notebook beneath her bed. As he turned pages, his hands began shaking violently. Things I need if I leave. Nobody would miss me until I was gone. If money makes people forget love, then I hate money. Each sentence stabbed deeper than the last. Then he found the final note. I tried to be good enough. Richard collapsed onto the floor. A sound escaped him that Maria had never heard before. Not anger, not frustration, pure devastation. She thought this was her fault, he whispered brokenly. Victoria arrived hours later, still wearing clothes from the previous day. Her makeup streaked from crying. The moment she entered Isabella's empty bedroom, she completely fell apart. She was right there, Victoria sobbed, and we still lost her. Outside, the storm continued raging while search teams combed frozen streets. Hour after hour passed with no sign of Isabella. Meanwhile, the little girl wandered farther, through unfamiliar neighborhoods, clutching her backpack tightly against the cold. Snow soaked through her boots. Her fingers burned painfully despite gloves. At first, adrenaline kept her moving. Exhaustion began replacing determination. By morning, she found temporary shelter beneath a closed laundromat awning downtown. Shivering violently, she pulled Mr. Bunny against her chest while watching strangers hurry past through snow. Nobody noticed the billionaire's missing daughter, sitting alone on freezing concrete. For the first time since leaving, fear finally overwhelmed her. She missed Maria, missed her room, even missed hearing her parents arguing downstairs because at least that meant they were home. A police car slowly passed nearby. Isabella hid immediately behind trash bins. She wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. Because part of her still believed returning would change nothing. Meanwhile, media coverage exploded nationwide once news leaked that billionaire Richard Carter's daughter vanished during a snowstorm. Reporters surrounded the mansion. Social media flooded with theories and speculation. But inside the Carter home, none of that mattered. Richard sat motionless in Isabella's room, staring at her drawings scattered across the floor. Every picture showed the same heartbreaking pattern: a tiny little girl standing far away from two adults. He had never noticed before. He couldn't stop seeing it. Richard hadn't moved from Isabella's room for hours. The snow outside had stopped by late morning. The silence inside the mansion felt heavier than the storm itself. Search teams came and went. Police radios crackled in distant corners of the house. Maria stood near the doorway trying to stay composed. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Victoria sat on the edge of Isabella's bed, holding the small stuffed rabbit. She kept pressing it against her chest, like it could somehow reverse time. Richard stared at the drawings on the floor again and again. Every single page was a reminder of what he had missed, not just moments. Years. A detective stepped into the room quietly. "We've expanded the search radius. We're checking shelters, subway tunnels, and buildings." But the storm made tracking difficult. Richard didn't respond immediately. Then he spoke, voice cracked and low. "She's 10. The detective nodded slowly. "We know, sir." "No," Richard said suddenly, standing up. "You don't understand. She's 10. She's never been outside this world alone. She doesn't even know how to ask for help properly." His voice broke at the end. Victoria looked up. For the first time, there was no pride left in her expression. No elegance. Calm. Just fear. "Real fear? I should have stayed," she whispered. Richard turned sharply toward her. "We both should have." Silence swallowed the room again. Outside, the mansion gates were still crowded with reporters, flashing cameras, and police vehicles. But inside, none of it mattered anymore. Because for the first time in their lives, money couldn't solve anything. Not influence. Not power, nothing. Just a missing child and a silence that kept growing louder every second. Across the city, Isabella sat curled beneath the same awning, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. The cold had stopped feeling sharp, just felt dull. Like everything else, she hadn't eaten since yesterday. Her small backpack sat beside her like a reminder of a life she wasn't sure she belonged to anymore. Mr. Bunny rested in her lap. Snow had melted slightly on the fabric, leaving it damp. A woman passed nearby carrying groceries and glanced briefly at her, kept walking. No one stopped. No one asked. Isabella watched their footsteps disappear into warm buildings and lit homes. Her lips trembled slightly. "I didn't think it would feel like this," she whispered to herself. She had imagined leaving would make people realize. Make them come. Make them care. The world outside the mansion didn't feel like that. It felt bigger, colder, stranger. And suddenly, the idea that no one might ever find her didn't feel impossible anymore. Her small hands tightened around the rabbit. "I just wanted you to notice me," she whispered again, softer this time. Her eyes slowly closed for a moment. Exhaustion pulled at her like a weight she couldn't fight. Back at the mansion, Maria suddenly rushed into the hallway holding her phone. "I found something!" Richard turned instantly. "What?" "There's a camera near the East Service Road. It picked up movement last night around 11:40. Victoria stood immediately. "Show me." They gathered around as the footage loaded. At first it was blurry, snow falling heavily, poor visibility. Then a small figure appeared, walking slowly, carrying a backpack. Richard's breath stopped. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. "That's her," The video continued. Isabella paused briefly near the gate, looked back once, then walked out, into the storm. Richard stumbled backward like he'd been hit. No, 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 no! He replayed it again, and again, each time worse, because each time he saw something new. The hesitation, the pause, the way she looked back like she was hoping someone would stop her. Victoria collapsed into a chair. She was waiting, she whispered. She was waiting for us. Maria wiped her face quickly. She didn't run away, she said softly. She left because she thought no one would come. That sentence broke everything left in the room. Richard grabbed his coat instantly. I'm going out. The detective stepped forward. Sir, we're still coordinating search zones. I don't care. Richard snapped suddenly. She's my daughter. His voice cracked. She's out there alone. For the first time, nobody stopped him. Because there was nothing left to argue with. Night fell again. The city lights blurred under fresh frost. Search teams continued moving through streets, calling her name into empty spaces. Isabella! Isabella Carter! But the wind swallowed most of it. Richard drove through neighborhoods himself, ignoring calls, ignoring instructions, ignoring everything except the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he would see her. Victoria stayed on the radio with emergency responders, her voice breaking every few minutes. Maria checked shelters door by door with officers. Hours passed, then more hours, until something finally changed. A patrol officer's voice came through the radio. We may have a possible sighting near Riverside District. Small child matching description seen earlier today. Richard's car screeched instantly. Send the exact location. He didn't wait for confirmation. He just drove, faster than he ever had in his life. Isabella was barely awake when she heard footsteps approaching. Heavy ones. Multiple people. She instinctively pulled herself closer to the wall, gripping Mr. Bunny tightly. Please don't see me, she whispered. The footsteps stopped near her. A flashlight beam swept across the awning, then paused. Over here, a voice called. Isabella froze. Her heart pounded violently. She tried to stand, but her legs were too weak. The light moved closer, and then, a voice she knew, broken. Isabella. She stopped breathing, slowly. She looked up. Richard stood only a few meters away, soaked, shivering, eyes red, face completely changed from the man she remembered. Behind him, Victoria and Maria were running toward them. Isabella only saw him. Her lips trembled. For a moment, neither moved. Then Richard dropped to his knees in the snow. I'm here, he said, voice cracking completely. I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't come sooner. Isabella stared at him like she wasn't sure he was real. Dad, she whispered. That one word shattered him. Yes, he said quickly. Yes, sweetheart. I'm here. Her grip on the rabbit loosened slightly. I thought you wouldn't find me, she said softly. Richard shook his head instantly. No, never. I would never stop looking for you. Victoria reached them moments later, collapsing beside them, pulling Isabella into her arms. Maria arrived seconds after, crying uncontrollably. Isabella didn't move at first. Then slowly, very slowly, she leaned into her mother, her small body finally giving in. I got scared. I know, Victoria cried. I know, baby. I know. Richard held both of them, shaking, unable to stop repeating the same words. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And for the first time in a long time, Isabella didn't feel invisible. Because she was finally being held like she mattered. The ambulance didn't take her because she was injured. It took her because she was exhausted, dehydrated, frozen, and emotionally shattered in a way no medical report could properly describe. Richard refused to leave her side even for a second. He sat inside the ambulance holding her small hand, while Victoria stayed close, gently brushing melted snow from Isabella's hair. Maria rode in the front seat with the driver, silently crying the entire way. Isabella barely spoke. Her eyes kept drifting shut, then opening again as if she was afraid that if she slept, she might wake up alone again. At one point she whispered softly, "Are you really here?" Richard squeezed her hand immediately.
Yes.
"I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Her lips trembled. "You always say that." The words didn't accuse him. They just hurt. Because they were true. The ambulance sirened, faded as they approached the private hospital owned by one of Richard's companies. Doctors rushed her inside immediately while nurses wrapped her in warm blankets and monitored her condition. Richard tried to follow. A nurse gently stopped him. "Sir, we need to examine her." For the first time in his life, Richard Carter stepped back, not because he was told to, but because he finally understood he had no control over what came next. Hours passed in a waiting room that felt too small for the kind of fear inside it. Victoria sat curled in a chair staring at her shaking hands. Maria prayed quietly in the corner. Richard paced endlessly, stopping only to look through the glass window into the pediatric room where Isabella lay connected to monitors. Machines beeped softly. She looked so small inside the hospital bed, too small. A doctor finally entered. All three stood instantly. "She's physically stable," the doctor said calmly. "Severe exhaustion, mild hypothermia, and dehydration. She'll recover." Relief should have come, didn't fully. Because the doctor hesitated before continuing. "There's something else." Richard's stomach tightened. "What?" "She's conscious. But emotionally, she's very withdrawn. That level of distress in a child usually means prolonged emotional trauma." Victoria whispered, "Can we see her?" The doctor nodded. "Only briefly. She needs rest." When they entered the room, Isabella turned her head slightly. She didn't smile, didn't cry, just looked at them, like she was trying to understand if this moment was real or temporary. Victoria walked first, slowly sitting beside her bed. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. Isabella didn't respond. Richard stepped closer, his voice shaking. "We're here now." A long silence followed. Then Isabella spoke quietly. "Why now?" The question landed harder than any accusation. Victoria's eyes filled instantly. "Because we were wrong," she whispered. "We were so wrong." Isabella looked away. "I waited a long time." Richard sat down slowly beside her bed, like his body couldn't hold itself upright anymore. "I know," he said. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying to fix that." Isabella blinked slowly. "You said that before." That sentence hit him harder than anything he had ever heard in his life. Because she was right. He had said it before, and failed before. Victoria reached for Isabella's hand gently. "This time is different," she said. "We understand now." Isabella didn't pull away. She didn't squeeze back either. That silence was louder than anything in the room. The days that followed were quiet in a way none of them had ever experienced before. No business calls, no meetings, no flights. Richard stayed at the hospital almost constantly. Victoria cancelled everything. Maria barely left Isabella's side when allowed. Slowly, Isabella recovered physically. But emotionally, something remained distant. She answered questions with short words. She smiled rarely, and she still woke up at night calling for Maria instead of her parents. One evening, Richard sat beside her bed after the room had gone quiet. "Can I ask you something?" he said gently. Isabella nodded slightly. "When did you decide to leave?" She stared at the blanket for a long time, then answered honestly, "When I stopped believing you would come first." Richard closed his eyes briefly. That sentence stayed with him longer than anything in his entire life. "I didn't know it hurt you this much," he said softly. Isabella finally looked at him. That's the problem. Silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of regret. Full of realization. Full of everything that should have been said years ago. A week later, Isabella was allowed to return home. Something had changed. The mansion no longer felt like a place of silence. It felt like a place under repair. Richard had removed his office setup from the house entirely. Victoria had cancelled all upcoming international commitments. They were both physically present, constantly, awkwardly, trying. At first, Isabella didn't trust it. She would wake up and check if they were still there. Sit at the breakfast table, quietly waiting for one of them to disappear again. Passed, and they stayed. Not perfectly, not magically, but consistently. Richard began walking her to school himself every morning. Victoria attended every small school activity she could find. Maria no longer functioned as replacement love, but as part of a family that was slowly learning how to exist together. One evening, Isabella sat in the garden, watching the fountain lights reflect on the water. Richard sat beside her. "I used to think providing everything meant being a good father," he said quietly. Isabella listened without interrupting. "I see now," he continued, "that I gave you everything except myself." She looked at him slowly. "That's what I wanted," she said softly. "Not things," he nodded. "I know." A pause. Then he asked something carefully. "Do you think we can fix it?" Isabella didn't answer immediately. She watched the water ripple for a long time, then said, "I don't know." And for the first time, Richard accepted that uncertainty without trying to control it, because healing wasn't something he could buy or promise into existence. It had to be earned, one day at a time. That night, Isabella placed Mr. Bunny back on her bed instead of holding it tightly like before. She didn't fully smile, but she also didn't cry, and for a child who had once walked into a storm just to be noticed, that was already a beginning.